You're listening to episode 27 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we speak with Dr. Linda Elder about critical thinking, what it really is, and how to develop it. In meditation, we take an intimate look at what's going on in our minds, moment by moment. Sometimes the attention is wonderfully on the breath, sometimes on the pain in our leg, and sometimes we're just watching the movie of our own mental proliferation. But our aim is to let go of the distractions so we can see things as they really are. Taking that off the cushion can be a bit more challenging, as we have more to contend with. Thoughts, even the very process of thinking, can in itself be a distraction from the current task at hand. This makes the need for clear thinking all the more important as we try to improve. We know from our experience in meditation that the untrained mind wanders, jumping from one thing to the next, and it's not always accurate in what it creates. This is where the skill of critical thinking comes in, because as we need to develop mindfulness to provide us with a good mental filter, we also need to develop the skill which helps the actively processing mind process better. Dr. Linda Elder is an educational psychologist and prominent authority on critical thinking. She has co-authored 4 books, including Critical Thinking, Tools for Taking Charge of Your Learning and Your Life, and 25 Days to Better Thinking and Better Living. Concerned with understanding and illuminating the relationship between thinking and effect, and the barriers to critical thinking, Dr. Elder has placed these issues at the center of her thinking and her work. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Pepsi throwback, if you can still find one. And I'm speaking today with Dr. Linda Elder. Linda, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So we were talking about critical thinking, and as secular Buddhists, one of the things that we do, as do other Buddhists, or meditators in general, is we're looking very closely at our mind and what's going on, and that has a very nice synchronous concept with critical thinking. So what I'd like to do is ask Linda how you came to have an interest in critical thinking and what led you to write a book about it.
Yes. Well, when I completed my doctorate, I had been an administrator at a college for a number of years while working on that. And I started teaching a class in psychology. All of my degrees are in psychology. And I started teaching a class, and I ran across the term critical thinking, and my first thought was, wow, that sounds interesting. And my second one was, what is that? And my third was, well, in connection to my teaching, I certainly hope that I am, whatever it is, I hope I'm doing it in my classes.
And that you ask things in order means you already had something of an ordered mind ready for critical thinking.
Well, it was a little daunting, quite frankly, at first, because I then began to read about critical thinking, study it. I went to some workshops actually hosted by the Foundation Center for Critical Thinking, and it was a big aha for me because I realized very early on that I really knew virtually nothing about critical thinking in the, let's say, deep sense of the term, and that it had not been fostered in my schooling in any kind of significant way, or let's say in an explicit way. And so I began to study about critical thinking and began to apply it in my classes, and very quickly realized that I had a lot more to learn, and that we are a very long way from really developing it in a kind of broad way, or cultivating it in a broad way in human societies. So there has been an evolution in my development from the beginning, which was, wow, what is this? Second, I hope I'm fostering it and realizing I wasn't to any significant degree. Third, recognizing that this is really, that is critical thinking is really the key, in my view, to the development of rational, fair-minded, critical society. So that's been an evolutionary process for me.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that completely, because as you mentioned in both the book and on the website, that muddled thinking, unclear thinking, non-critical thinking, which isn't necessarily even considered real thinking, causes a great many of the problems that we experience in our daily lives.
One of the biggest problems that we face is that, as you know, if you read the paper or you listen to people talk today, you often do hear the term critical thinking. And the use of the words is becoming more common, especially in the last, let's say, 3 decades. And at least 3 presidents have called for critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking. But when you begin to press on what is actually being done in reference to that, it's very little. And what is worse, most people would say that critical thinking is a wonderful thing, and 2, if you ask them, well, what actually is it, there would be a pause.
Well, what do you think it means?
Exactly. But third, they would say that they are the ones that are definitely doing it. So that the problem is that if everyone just thought like me, the world would be a whole lot better place.
Right, exactly. Showing
see?
the bias, which is part of the problems of critical thinking.
And it really gets at the root of the problem that we face that critical thinking answers. And the root of the problem is that humans, though we naturally reason, and there are a lot of actual skills in that process, involved in that process, though we reason, and we reason, let's say, at least 100 times a day or something like that. We begin with assumptions, we make inferences, we use ideas in our reasoning and so forth. Though we do all of these things, we don't automatically reason well. And yet at the same time, we think that we do. So we don't naturally see problems in our thinking. That is, intrinsically, these problems don't jump out at us. So if I'm being biased, there's no red light going on in my mind saying, oh, you're being biased right now, you need to correct that. No, it looks to the mind, bias, prejudice, distortions, delusions, illusions, all of these look to the mind as perfectly reasonable and rational.
Right. And that would be part of what I would suggest for those of you who are listening to the podcast who are meditators, and particularly if you're doing insight meditation. That's part of our insight practice, is looking at what's going on and how we are sometimes deluding ourselves into what's going on in our heads. Linda, one of the definitions that is on the website, which is for people listening, www.criticalthinking.org, is that critical thinking is the art of analyzing and evaluating thinking with a view to improving it. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about that, because there's some really good concepts wrapped up into that definition.
There are some. And let me step back a minute and say that there are many ways to approach critical thinking. And so there's not one definition. This is a good one to start with. But there are many ways to approach it, and when we approach it from this angle, what is illuminated for us is 3 major things. One is that we need to be able to analyze our thinking, which makes perfect sense. And what critical thinking does for us is it provides actual explicit tools for this. Now, when I was studying psychology, I was introduced to the term metacognition. It made perfect sense to me. Thinking about your thinking, that sounds good. But I did not have a sense of how one might go about this. So if I said to you, Ted, you know what you need to do? You just need to think about your thinking. Well, you can there's a little bit of distance you can get in that if there's a specific problem that we're dealing with. But when you bring in the tools of critical thinking, then I think you have a systematic way of approaching the improvement of thought. So let's take analysis. All reasoning entails 8 elements of reasoning that really are clusters of elements. But so let me just kind of briefly walk through this. Whenever you reason, whether you're reasoning at the highest or the lowest level of quality or somewhere in between, there are 8 parts. You have a purpose. You cannot reason without a purpose. You use information in your reasoning. You're asking some questions or a question. You make inferences. You begin with assumptions, or you take some things for granted. There are ideas in your thinking or concepts that are guiding your thinking. There are implications of your thinking, and you are thinking from some point of view. Now, these parts are present in your thinking. If we know this and we take this seriously, then we have 8 angles for entering our thinking. So we can see from this that there is a problem in our thinking. We can look for where the problem is in these 8 parts. So if you're assuming something, for example, that you should not be assuming, you're taking something for granted that needs to be questioned, and you understand that you're constantly using assumptions when you're reasoning, then you begin to look for those. So if you're in a relationship with someone and you're having a disagreement and you start to think about the reasoning that you're doing and that this other person is doing, you can start to, for example, say, okay, what are you assuming right now about our relationship? And what am I assuming right now? And maybe there is a problem at the level of assumptions. Maybe I'm assuming that you want more from the relationship than I want, or whatever the case may be. So there are actual entry points when you understand these 8 elements. And just a couple of other examples. So let's take implications. Whenever you reason, there are implications of your reasoning. In other words, there are ideas or consequences logically connected to whatever it is that you're reasoning about. And if you don't think through those implications, there can be all kinds of problems for you in your life or for other people that are connected with you. And take a very simple example. If you drink alcohol and drive, there are implications that are implicit in that situation. And it behooves you to actually think through those implications before you get into the car and drive.
Right. And this fits in so beautifully with a lot of the early Buddhist concepts of your cause and effect, exactly what you've just been talking about, your assumptions about, well, what is right view? What am I bringing to the table that maybe isn't actually there? And that's one of the things that I admired very much about the book and what you have laid out here is that it is very systematic, and there are specific tools to help with critical thinking. It's not just a buzz phrase.
That's right.
There are specific things you can do. And
that's what really appeals to me about the approach that we take to critical thinking. Now, let me just say that any kind of high-quality thinking in any particular context, in a way, has to count for critical thinking, because it is thinking that is doing what it needs to do in that situation. And but the problem is, if there are any problems with the thinking that you're doing, and you need to intervene in the thinking, if you don't have these tools, how are you going to intervene in the thinking?
Right.
You see? So let me give you the other set of tools that was in the definition that you read from our work, and that is, so we analyze thinking in order to assess thinking. Now, I've talked a little about analysis, the 8 elements of reasoning. Now let's talk a little about assessment. Now, once we take our thinking apart, and so I say, okay, here's my purpose, here's my question, here's the implications, here's the information I'm using, now I need to be able to assess the reasoning I'm doing, and I need to use standards that make sense for me to use. So, here are some. We start with 9, what we call essential intellectual standards, but there are many, many, many others in natural languages. So we want to make sure, for example, that our thinking is clear. So clarity is an important intellectual standard. We want to make sure that our thinking is accurate. We want to make sure that our thinking is relevant. We want to make sure that it is logical, consistent. Well, I'm actually moving off of my 9, but I'll just throw some more out. So significant, fair in context. We want to make sure that it is precise, that it contains enough details to do the job that it needs to do, and so forth. So I move around the standards as we all should do. The point is that if we use these intellectual standards explicitly in our thinking, we can immediately upgrade the quality of our thinking. Now, let me just give you a couple of examples. If you and I are in a conversation, and we are in one right now, and there is anything that I say that is not clear to you, and you're clear about intellectual standards, then the standard of clarity will jump out to you, and you'll say, wait a minute, I don't understand what you just said.
Right.
Okay? Now, you do this implicitly. We all do it implicitly, but sometimes we act on information or ideas that we are not clear about. So we're able to intervene and say, okay, am I really clear about what he is saying or what she is saying before I move on? Or let's say accuracy is another very important intellectual standard. We use that in our thinking already, but do we use it, as it were, 100% of the time when we need to be using it? We want to make sure that information that we use is accurate, and often people will throw out statistics, for example, that just aren't accurate, and we just go with them because we don't check the sources. We want to make sure that our thinking is logical in context. Are we coming to conclusions that make sense? So if I need to buy a car and I want to buy the one that makes most sense for me, am I making the best decision given all of the things that I'm looking for in a car? So I'm looking for a logical conclusion for my situation. So when we take intellectual standards seriously, then we upgrade our thinking. So that's the analysis and the assessment part, and there's a whole lot of depth in this, as you can see. And the goal is to think at the highest level of quality that we possibly can throughout our lives, and so that we can make the best decisions that we can. And I will go one step further, and then I'll let you get a word in edgewise, and I'll say that there are two different let's say, ways that we can use critical thinking. And this distinction is very important. It sets our work apart from some other theoretical work, not all, but some, and that is that critical thinking can be used either in what we call the strong sense or the ethical sense, or it can be used in the unethical sense. So you can think really well while being selfish, and there are countless examples of this in human life.
Every day.
Every day. Or you can think very well to achieve your own purposes. There's nothing wrong with that, but while also considering the rights and needs of others. So that's the ethical way of approaching critical thinking. And this is the one that we are so much concerned about. And so we put fair-minded critical thinking at the front and center of our work at the Foundation and Center for Critical Thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed I'm taking a look at one of the pages on the website, which has the definitions and things like that, as the Where to Begin page that you have. And by the way, for folks listening to the podcast, we'll have a link to this website on the episode page for this episode. And one of the things that I liked about what you're just describing is you have a beautiful graphic there that shows the relationship of the standards to the elements to the intellectual traits. Mm-hmm. And something that stood out very much for me in going through this and having read the book about a year ago and going through it a couple of times as reference, the things that I see that I keep tripping up on myself, for example, is that my own references are just wholly within my own point of view. It's sometimes very challenging for me to get outside of that point of view. And so when you were describing clarity a minute ago, are we seeing things clearly? One of the dangers I've noted in my own practice and just my daily living and use of critical thinking and meditation and so on is that the clarity question isn't just, am I perceiving this with clarity, yes or no? It's, do I even know whether my perception about this is correct? I may think that I'm seeing it clearly, but not. And that's part of that, I think, is where point of view is coming in, that there's a little bit of a feedback loop there that you need to constantly be checking yourself and checking your own point of view. And that's one of the things that I liked most about the book, Critical Thinking, Tools for Taking Charge of Your Learning in Your Life, is that you make that reference in case very strongly that we can fool ourselves and we do need to check, and that there is some feedback and there is a systemic way and a process by which you can improve your critical thinking.
Absolutely. And I think, you see, no matter how good our thinking is, no matter how deeply we study critical thinking, and very few people, by the way, do, as far as I can tell, but no matter how seriously you take critical thinking, thinking within another person's point of view is going to be a challenge, especially if you disagree with that view. But if you step back and you think about what you're asking of your mind logically, you can see why it would be difficult to enter anyone's point of view at all, even if you agreed with them or thought you did, because you see the world from your point of view. You don't ever see it really from anyone else's. You only see it through your point of view, through someone else's, when you're actually trying to see their point of view. So in other words, you are seeing anyone else's point of view through the lenses of your own point of view, and it is very hard to set that aside. Imagine a human animal that functioned very differently from the way that we function. Imagine if we, instead of having to think through our own point of view to someone else's point of view, that we automatically saw other people's points of view. Right? I mean, and if you could imagine such a world, it would be very different from the world that we have today. And the reason is because whenever you are, for example, doing anything unethical to someone else, or let's say harming them, you would be feeling their emotions, and you would be thinking within their own way of looking at it. So, for example, take torture. Torture can only exist because we don't have to actually think within someone else's point of view.
Right. We don't have to suffer what they're suffering.
That's right. If you automatically felt their pain, you couldn't inflict the pain that you're inflicting. You would feel it, and so you would stop. You would not want to do that. But because of human ideologies, because humans think within ideas and concepts, and these can be very complex and very distorted, we can justify all kinds of egregious actions, behaviors through these ideas. So, in other words, we can tell ourselves, this person that I am torturing deserves this because this is not actually a person. It's a person, it's a non-entity, someone that is a threat, that deserves the punishment that they get, and so forth and so on. So these are rationalizations that enable us to do these to delude ourselves into thinking that we're doing something that makes perfect sense, when in actuality, we are simply harming someone, and they deserve, for us not to be doing that.
Right. And this ties very much in with our practice in meditation, is not just compassion for others, but that deep understanding. And some of what our objectives are in meditation is to, you were mentioning that we can never really see things from the other guy's point of view. Not really. We can try and we can get close. Part of what we do in our meditation is try to brush away the stuff that gets in the way of us seeing it as clearly as we can, being an entirely different individual. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what are some of the challenges that you face in teaching critical thinking? Because it's some of it, I imagine, is a bit difficult a concept to get across to people.
It is, as you see, because first of all, we need time. And I think one of the big barriers is that we never really have enough time to help people get to the deeper layers and so that they really understand critical thinking. And you know, there are many reasons why it's difficult to teach critical thinking. One is that I've already mentioned, that people already think that their thinking is good enough, right? And faculty or teachers already think that their teaching is good enough. And if everyone just taught like them, the education problems would be solved. And so you have that beginning problem, and that actually comes from I think mainly from our egocentric nature. That is, you know, we automatically think that our thinking is right and correct and true.
The conceit of self, yes.
Yes, so that's the first problem. And then there are many other problems. One of them is that critical thinking is not yet considered a discipline of its own, and maybe it's not ready to be its own discipline. But it is anything and everything to anyone and everyone to some extent. Although primary theoreticians do agree on a common core. But the words are thrown around by lots of different people for lots of different reasons. And so, and in many schools and universities, institutions, think of critical thinking as something that you can get in a 2-day workshop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and then you'll be fine. You go through the workshop, you get your certificate, and you're a critical thinker.
Exactly. And they don't realize that it's more like learning to play the violin. Yes, and it's not like learning to even play basketball, where you could learn to play basketball, at least be able to play a little bit with just a little bit of instruction, right? And you can throw up the ball, and if you're a good athlete, you may get the ball in the hoop quite a number of times. Well, critical thinking to me is not like that. It is much more like learning to play the violin. If I said, how long would it take you to learn to play the violin? And you said,
well, knowing me, much longer than it would take, say, my brother, who's musically talented.
and see, that's also part of it. And it also depends on what you mean by that. Do you mean by that to play it, you know, in front of my family, or like to play it and actually in front of, you know, a lot of people? And
Three Blind Mice or Paganini?
Exactly.
It could be a difference.
So in order to learn to think critically, so that our thinking is doing the job that it needs for us to do in the world that we live in today in a kind of broad sense, means that humans have got to start taking their thinking seriously in the way that they would take playing the violin seriously, or take, let's say, getting into and staying into physically good shape. So people who are in good physical shape take their bodies seriously, and they are committed to it, and they work on it every day. Maybe not 5 hours a day, but sometime per day. Well, so the thinking is being largely ignored in human societies. So the one thing that could solve our problems is the one thing that's being ignored. So, but it's not completely being ignored. It's just it's not being given enough attention for us to begin to turn around in any significant way these tremendous problems that we face living on the planet today. So when teachers say to me, look, our instruction's working, then I say, okay, and then I say, well, let's look at your graduates. And let's see what kinds of thinking they can or cannot do when they leave your schools, colleges, and universities. Because if our instruction is working, then why do we have these problems that we face?
Right. Well, I wonder if some of that is as you were describing the person who goes and takes a 2-day seminar, and they think they're a critical thinker, but we know that there's more to it than that. It isn't just here's a large set of practices. It's how to do the practice. Maybe one of the challenges that people have in coming out of a class and then moving forward with it.
Absolutely. Now, let me suggest we have a small book that I recommend for this purpose, and it's called 25 Days to Better Thinking and Better Living. It's on our website, And this book was designed for precisely that purpose, because at the end of a 2-day workshop, people would come up to me and say, yeah, but how do you do this?
Right. Yes.
This stuff is great, but how do you do it? And so I realized that, we really are asking a lot of people to learn these concepts and to deeply internalize them on their own. So in the 25 Days book, the idea is to take one big idea from critical thinking per day and really focus on that idea. So it might be think about implications. So today, just focus on the implications. Whenever you say anything to anyone, ask yourself, what are the implications of what I'm saying? Or when they say something to you, ask the same thing. And actually, it's designed to be used over 25 weeks, but our publisher said, well, we can't do it over 25 weeks because nobody's going to do anything for 25 weeks. So it's got to be 25 days.
There's a keen insight to human nature.
Exactly. And I said, well, how about just 25 minutes or, 25 seconds? So this is a book that I recommend because though it doesn't, we don't take an integrated approach, we do give people just ways into the ideas.
Mm-hmm. And give them an exposure to start them on a path where critical thinking can be incorporated into their daily life without to the level of, say, the critical thinking book, which goes into, the college level course on the full blown. It's something they can do, and that's one of the things I like best about this is that you're giving them, here's the practice, go to it.
Exactly. And if you think about it, there are some very powerful ideas that if you just took one or two or three of them seriously, your life would change. And let me give you one, and that is intellectual empathy. And in our 25 Days book, we suggest learn to empathize with others. So if we all, it goes back to my previous example, if we all could really imagine what it's like to be someone else, and we did that regularly, if you did nothing else but that one thing, but you did it over and over again in every part of your life, and you lived in such a way that you were naturally empathetic, the world would be a different place.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we don't have to do everything, but we have to do something.
Yeah. You don't have to swallow the entire ocean. Just have a glass of water. Start where you can start.
And a glass of water every day. That's it. And so it's back to back to your point about practice. That we have a stage theory that we have developed, and one of them is the practicing thinker stage. And it's sort of like an athlete is consistently practicing in order to improve. And we have to begin to take this approach to our thinking if we're going to be able to solve these problems that are now facing us. So if we every day do something, it doesn't have to be, as I said, 5 hours a day, but it could be 15 minutes a day, it can be 30 minutes a day. And if we can find partners to do this with us so that we're sort of holding each other responsible to help discipline our minds, I think that's a way in.
Yeah, we're just seeing the similarities between this and just a straight meditative practice in Buddhism, that what you're describing is very much a practice and a community of support and the learning, and these are all very much a part of what we do. In particular with secular Buddhism, we approach this from a very intellectual, practice-based stance rather than any dependence on anything from outside. It's on you. And it's something that we need to do, exactly as it was critical thinking, and seeing things as they really are is one of our favorite phrases. Linda, one of the things I wanted to ask you and give you opportunity to talk about is on the website there are a great many educational opportunities that you described. This seems to be a site that's very much based on educating people. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, we have a large library of articles that anyone can read and download. And what we like about this is that it offers the ideas for people all over the world that could not afford the materials or ever come to any of our events. So that's the first thing that I would say is spend some time with those articles, and there's a lot there. obviously we offer a number of resources for people to purchase through our website, and we've been developing these materials over 30 years. Some of them are curriculum materials, some of them, as we've been discussing, are for anyone interested in critical thinking. And as I said, I suggest the 25 Days to Better Thinking and Better Living as a starting place, and Critical Thinking Tools for Taking Charge of Your Personal and Professional Life is another book for just anyone interested in critical thinking. There are a number of activities throughout the book that people can work through in terms of practice. There are we have forums where people can join discussions. We offer an online course, and this is mainly for instructors, but really anyone could benefit from it. And we offer conferences and events which are posted on our website as soon as they're as soon as the information is available. We just finished our 30th International Conference on Critical Thinking. And so I strongly suggest that people try to attend at least one, if not more, of our events. So there's a lot for people to participate in terms of our work and in terms of our website.
Yeah, I just noticed that in the education opportunities for people who are educators listening to this, and I know you guys are out there, that it's particularly targeted for different levels of the classroom. And you will see these references on the website. And I also did want to mention that we did just miss the International Conference on Critical Thinking for 2010, but I see you've already got an ad up for the 2011 conference, the 30th International Conference, would it be, in July of 2011.
It's actually the 31st that we need to switch out that logo. That's kind of confusing, but we need to, do a little bit of work on our website. But it's the 31st coming up next year. That's right. And that will be in Berkeley. And let me just comment that at that conference, this will be our 31st, and it is the oldest conference held anywhere in the world. Our conference on critical thinking was the first, conference, held in 1980. And we've had one every year, obviously, and it is geared mainly toward educators at all levels, but we also have people from business, we have people from government, military, we have people who are home study parents, we have people just interested in critical thinking. So once we post our sessions, people can go on and see that there is a lot there. And in any case, anyone interested in critical thinking should come.
Right.
Because it gives you a very good jump start with the work, and certainly you can get this with the materials that you read, but I just find that there's that connection that we're able to make with people at our conferences, and people are able to work together in sessions and really learn from one another, so it's a wonderful opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, is there anything else that, we mentioned a few things that were barriers to critical thinking. Were there any others that you wanted to bring up?
I'd like to just mention a couple. And let me just say that our goal, and speaking for myself, my goal in the work that I do is to do whatever I can to help create a more rational society or more rational societies. And by that I mean more reasonable, more logical, and most importantly, more fair and more just. Right now, half the world's population lives in absolute poverty. There is tremendous suffering throughout the planet, and this suffering is just simply not necessary. And it's mainly caused, in my view, by problems in human thinking. And one of the reasons is because of egocentric thinking. We are naturally selfish. We're centered in ourselves. We see the world from our own point of view, and it's very difficult to get out of that. And there's another problem connected with this, and it's sociocentric thinking. Humans are social animals. We see the world from social perspectives, and part of this is that we tend to think that our group is the best group. And that our group is right. Just like, when we think egocentrically, I'm right. When I'm thinking sociocentrically, we are right. And we, in part of sociocentric thinking as well, is about inculcating people within the culture into the ideologies of the culture. So there is indoctrination. We must adhere to social conventions and ideologies. There are taboos that we have to be aware of, and all of these are problems that come from our social orientation. And at present, people are really not seeing through this problem and seeing all of the implications of the problem. And so we've got to begin to think about these natural intrinsic barriers to the development of human cultures, and to see that, for example, let's look at, I was listening to the radio the other day and listening to a talk show, and this person was talking about how we are a species perpetually at war. And our country is now perpetually at war. And we are coming out and saying this is what we need to be doing. We need to be at war. Well, that's very much a sociocentric orientation. It's not a fact. It's a way of looking at the world. But there are actual serious implications of this way of looking at the world. And are we creating a more safe world because we are at war? I don't think so. I think we're creating a more dangerous world every day. There are fewer and fewer countries where, for example, Americans can even travel anymore. And that's because more and more people in the world hate our guts. And we have to ask ourselves, why is this true? I mean, why is this the case? And there are all kinds of people caught up in, the crossfires, all kinds of innocent people suffering because of this way of thinking about war, and that comes from our sociocentric orientation. So I would say that the problems that we face are deep, they are serious, they will not be addressed in any kind of Band-Aid approach in the way that we've tried to approach them. And until we learn to take thinking seriously and begin to really cultivate critical societies, I don't think we're going to be able to create the kind of world that is possible, that is fair, and that is just for all people and all other sentient creatures living in it. So that is my final word.
Yeah, I would agree with that very much so, because we don't often think of the causes and conditions on a scale beyond the first 5 feet in front of us. And it's very much as you were saying, it's that conceit of self, and our particular our society is right, and therefore that means we have to, for example, be at war all the time. I would suggest that we maybe need to look at what is the society, what's the world that we want to live in. Is it one where we're constantly at war? I would say probably not. I'd rather not have that be our way of going forward for all time. I'd rather we live in a peaceful and just society where we can have a great deal of variety and diversity in people and ideas and ways of living that are at the very least coexisting, if not very happily encouraging and fostering one another. And we're not going to get there with that inability to see the other person, and especially see ourselves and what we're getting at. Dr. Linda Elder, educational psychologist at the Foundation for Critical Thinking. Thank you so much for being here. This has been wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.